Welcome to week 4 and the social economy. A fair bit to get through today, so we will get cracking on it. If you recall, a few weeks ago, I introduced you to Gonzalez's model, the people with nature, where he represented the relationship between the natural resources on Earth, or as he calls it, natural capital, and as one sphere, and the other sphere representing you and I, human-made capital, or the social systems, the organizational structures within a society, which could be family, it could be cities, countries, or businesses, those structures and how they go about transforming goods. So what we do as humans is we extract resources from the natural world, represented by that green arrow up there, ecosystem services, and we transform them. So we take cotton and we spin it, we weave it, and we trade it, we sell it, we wear it, and then when we're finished with it, we will uh, give it back, if you like, to the ecological system. Now, in Gonzalez's ideal model, it's safekeeping, conservation, and restoration. What tends to happen is we simply throw it out and it's garbage, and we just dump it into the earth and leave it there. And as we've said, because of population pressures and also a consumption-based model, or materialistic based model, we're generating a lot of garbage and we're just dumping it into the ecological system that we then need to extract more resources to do it again, and that's becoming a problem. So we tried to quantify the ecological systems by way of the planetary boundaries. So over the last 2 weeks, rather than describe it as a big green ball, we've said let's identify it as 9 planetary boundaries: climate change, ocean acidification, etc. And so by first understanding or quantifying the green ball, the ecological systems, we can then start to measure our impact on it and ask ourselves, is this the right thing to be uh, extracting from the earth or doing with the earth to make our particular garment? So what we're going to do today is focus on the social systems. We'll apply a theory for the social systems. And the two that we're going to look at are these bottom two spheres here, the Doughnut Economics, which is primarily what we're going to talk about today. And then right near the end, I'll discuss the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, but I won't spend a great deal of time on those ones, as I'll explain a bit later on. So, why is it called Doughnut Economics? Have a wild guess. Look at this. If you use your imagination, you should be able to see a big donut, particularly if you're hungry. And right at the center of that donut, we have what Kate Raworth, who's the author, British-based author of this theory, suggests is critical human deprivation. So she's saying that this is the space where there's people who do not have either enough food or justice or prospects for a better future in their lives. So some call it poverty. That can take many forms as well. And her suggestion is that you cannot have balance in the environment, you cannot have sustainability until you address this problem. Because if there are people who are poor in the world who have nothing, then they will use the resources around them, the natural resources, to try to get ahead in life. So the environment and social justice go hand in hand, if you like. Now, what she suggests is that every human being has a desire to have a better standard of living, or a better life if you want. So her suggestion is this sad emoji in the middle starts to track out of the center of the circle and habitate a place that's in the light green, the safe and just place for humanity. And this is one where they've got enough to eat, food, shelter, and opportunity for a prosperous future. However, she says she also suggests that some societies and some people on this pathway of improving their lives haven't stopped at that safe and just space for humanity. They've actually gone further and they've overshot the environmental ceiling and moved into what's represented by this freaked out emoji there, beyond the critical natural thresholds. And these are represented by, if you recall, in week one, our friend who's sitting up in the tree, um, sawing the limb on which he's sitting. He's living unsustainably. He's consuming resources from the earth that his children will not have the opportunity to consume. So it's a term called intergenerational equity, where we consume our children's resources and consume or deny them opportunities in that future world because we're living comfortably right now. So her suggestion, if you like, the developed world has to pull back and change how much they consume and how they consume to move within this environmental ceiling. So basically meaning not over consuming. And we also must allow people in the least developed countries to improve their standard of living to move into that balanced space. Excuse me. Once again, unless you resolve this tension between the absolute richest people on earth and the poorest people on earth, you can't address the problem of environmental sustainability. It's all interlinked. So let's put some labels around this donut. And if we look at the inner ones, what she's saying is the path out of critical human deprivation is by way of ensuring there's adequate food, water, health, education, income, work, etc. And we're going to look at all of these individually today. But all of these are pathways or stepping stones in which we can allow humans to improve their lot in life. And you'll notice on the outer limit of the donut some terms that you're quite familiar with: climate change, ocean acidification, chemical pollution is the new term used by Johan Rockström. So these are the 9 planetary boundaries. It's excuse me. What I represented to you was the previous draft. This is a new draft that they've done. What they've changed basically is land conversion. We called it land system change. So it's more of a succinct uh, um, reading of it. Fresh water is now called freshwater withdrawals. Nitrogen and phosphorus loading was biogeochemical. Chemical pollution is, excuse me, is novel entities. So, which we said predominantly was plastics as such. So slight changes in the terminology, but fundamentally the same. So here is an example of the combination of two theories: Rockström's theory, which sets the limits of the ecological ceiling and how much we can consume and change, and Kate Raworth's social foundation, or means by which human beings can get into that safe zone. What it means for our business is twofold. It means as a business we have to make sure that we don't negatively impact on these external aspects, the 9 planetary boundaries, but at the same time, as a business that employs and engages people in the production of clothing and retailing of clothing, we have to ensure that anyone in our supply chain has adequate amounts of these elements in there. So once again, it becomes like a checklist that we can use to measure and strategize our path forward for our business. Now, I'm going to start in a place that has nothing to do with fashion, once again, but it's the English Channel. And if you're familiar with this part of the world, you'll know it's 2 countries, France and the United Kingdom, are very close to each other, separated by a body of water, but they are connected by a tunnel which goes under the ocean, a rail tunnel. And I'm just going to show you this YouTube clip of a few years ago now of this is people in France, refugees in France, trying to get onto trucks, which will then go onto a train, which will then go to England. And let's just watch this, and then I'll talk about it in a bit of detail.
These incredible pictures that we've had from our helicopter, and these show what is happening in Calais, where lorries are either stationary or slow moving, and it's leading to an opportunity for migrants who have been camped out in Calais to try to hop on board those lorries as they attempt to get across the channel to Britain.
Now, as you can see, there's no police stopping them. There's no security of any sort at this stage. They're simply trying to get on. The trucks don't even try to stop them either. They just continue to go. Some are lucky enough to get into the United Kingdom. Some are stopped either before the truck gets on the train or at the other end. The point is, this is a representation of, or symbolic of, the refugee flows that are happening around the world at the moment, and everyone is suggesting will continue to happen. So what's that got to do with us? Well, I'll show you that once again in a different context. Have a look at this map here. This is refugee flows, and just watch the direction from 2000 to 2016. Watch the direction of the dots to see the movements of people. So it represents, one dot is 17 refugees, and you can see pretty significant flows occurring. That's 2003, 2004, so gravitating towards Western Europe, the United States, a few into Australia, but representing what it largely represents is people in a position of critical human deprivation in the center of Cape Raworths Doughnut, trying to better themselves, trying to find a better life. And so you're getting these significant flows of people, and growing, partly because it's easier to communicate, so it's easier to tell other people what's the best way in, partly because there's more transport, and because of the interconnectivity of countries around the world as well. So this is an important issue for us because a lot of these people end up in factories that make our clothes. So having an understanding of who makes our clothes, where they've come from, why they're working in that place is of importance. So it's just to give us a bit of a holistic picture of what's happening in the world today. And why in particular refugees? Well, because any destabilisation in one part of the world reverberates to other parts of the world, and that issue, those images of refugees trying to get into the United Kingdom, played a significant role in the vote for Brexit, for the United Kingdom trying to isolate itself from the European Union, because simply a lot of UK citizens felt like they weren't in control of their country anymore. People were just coming in as they felt like it, and they were losing their identity. So it has all sorts of knock-on effects when we have destabilisation. So whether it's 9/11, things like negative interest rates in Europe, which means if you put money in a bank, you have to pay the bank to keep your money in there rather than the bank pays you. And all of this means you have to keep an eye on the broader picture to understand the best way in which you manage your business. I mean, we're seeing that more so now than at any other time, because with COVID-19, we are seeing the impact of a pandemic on economies and of people around the world. There's our friend the virus there. Okay, if we zoom into the fashion industry, then it's best represented by the Rana Plaza collapse in Bangladesh in 2013, where you had a building, this building here, which housed a number of different factories, all making clothing predominantly for Western brands. And the building was of poor design and poor construction. It collapsed, killing something like 1,600 factory workers in there. So amongst the bodies that were in that were also brands like Benetton. So obviously a brand like Benetton, which I should have brought up before. I don't know if you're familiar with Benetton. low-end dish, low-end brand, Italian brand of clothing. Um, but obviously what they do is middle to low. Well, wherever. Let's go to Denmark. Um, come on, bit slow. What they do is, as you know, in the fashion industry, at whatever level, it's all about projecting an image, and they spend a lot of money projecting an image about themselves, not just the clothes, but also who's meant to be wear them, who the target market is, etc. What image they don't want to have is of their brand next to this sort of situation. And so as a result of that, it wasn't just Benetton, it was also, I believe, Kmart Australia was had outsourced some of the manufacturing to that factory. So what happens is that human rights campaigners like avaz.org, which created a petition to raise awareness of the issue, and they do it often, and basically they try to get as many signatures as they can, which then is then used as an effective tool to communicate how many people are aware of it. So in this little clip here, it's 1.2 million people was their target at that stage to um, sign the petition and have an awareness of what Benetton did. So obviously Benetton, you know, does take an interest when 1.2 million people associate Benetton with poor factory conditions. Why the factory was constructed poorly is an issue to do with the builders, but what it meant was that rents were cheaper because it was a poor building, and that meant that clothes were cheaper, which is appealing to Benetton or other Western brands because they get the clothes cheaper. I mean, there's a reason why clothes are cheap. It's not just cheap wages, it's cheap buildings, cheap infrastructure. Unfortunately, it's not the first time it's happened in the world. It's happened a number of times. If we go back just over 100 years ago to New York, and remember, New York 100 years ago was what China is today when it comes to garment manufacturing. It was the epicenter of garment manufacturing for the United States predominantly. Most of the workers in there were migrant workers, so they didn't have the English language, they had minimal skills, and so they took jobs in factories making clothes. So it's the same story being repeated as you see now in Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka, in India, and as I said, parts of China. So in 1911, it was a Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. In this case, a fire broke out and you'll see it in the when we do our tutorial. Fire broke out on one of the floors. I think it was the 8th floor. Um, the women couldn't get out because the doors were locked, and they were locked because the bosses liked to keep them locked because they didn't want the girls to go out for a cigarette break or toilet break or anything. And so the women that were in there had the option of either burning to death or jumping out of the building and falling to the floor and dying that way. So it was a pretty horrific incident that became the catalyst for change in the textiles industry in the United States, and also the catalyst for change for women's rights in the United States. So Rose Schneiderman was one of the key campaigners that came out of that and was instrumental in improving the living standards of textile workers and garment workers. Just as the Rana Plaza collapse did the same thing. After 2013 and a lot of protests, the government agreed to double the wages of garment workers. So it doubled it to, I think it was 65 US dollars a month was their new wage. Still incredibly low, but double. So the fashion industry and social injustices have a sad history that in the 21st century needs to be addressed for no other reason apart from the moral issues than the fact that you can't get away with this century. It's very hard with transparent supply chains, with instant communication, social networking. It's very hard, but not impossible, to still run a business that exploits people. So let's jump. What we're going to do, so sorry, I'll just jump back. We're going to go through each one of these. I'll do them fairly quickly. Some are sort of rather self-explanatory. But Kate Raworth suggests that education of your workforce is important. And the more education that is accumulated by the individual, the greater the productivity, because if you have a country of educated people, in theory, they produce more valuable products and services. Education increases social mobility because it increases your salary, increases the neighbourhood you live in, the people you surround yourself with. So you've got the opportunity to move up, if you like. Increases technological advances, obviously. And if you look at this chart here, I just want to show you this one. This is age on the x-axis and rate of return to investment in human capital. So what this means is that, so from zero to high. So if we spend money on a child at preschool, the rate of return, the benefits that our society gets from spending that money is quite high, is up here. As the person gets older, the benefits we get from educating that person gets lower and lower and lower. And by the time it gets to post school, it's quite low. And that's basically because at the ages of 20 plus, as you'd all know, it's impossible to tell you anything because you know everything. We have firm ideas, as we all do, as we get older. That's why there's a lot of emphasis on preschooling and educating children as young as possible, or starting the education as young as possible, to ensure that they get the best chance of life. Now, difficult to do if you have 5 children, or 5.1 children in the case of Bangladeshi women in 1981, because if you got 5 children, you have to pay for the education of 5 children. And so what would tend to happen is that maybe the first child goes to school, or the first 2 children go to school, but the other 3 don't go to school. Or depending on which cultural background it is, the first male goes to school, but the girls don't go to school. But as that society changed, and as we moved to women having 2 children, 2.15 children, then obviously they've got more money to spend on those two, on the education of those 2 children. So basically what we find is that the more children you have, at one level, it can improve your standard of living because those children can provide for the parents as the parents get older. But by the same time, it's costing more for people to raise those children. As we said a couple of weeks ago when we looked at population growth, and we said that in the West or in developed countries, uh, women aren't having many children, partly because of the cost of raising them. So it's just something to note there. Education. So what that means for us, if we employ people to work in a factory, do we have an obligation to give them some form of training in that factory? Should we give them opportunities to um, develop skills on other sewing machines rather than just leave them on one machine and don't think about it? Just get them to make the garments, and it's their problem if they want to advance their own career. So it's up to us to be proactive as a company if we want to do that. Kate Raworth says gender equality is also important. And if I quote Jeffrey Sachs here, who wrote the book The Age of Sustainable Development, book worth reading or having a look at to get a bit of an understanding of all of this in greater depth. But he says a society that tries to run on half its brain power and talents, that disenfranchises half the population and that blocks women from problem solving, economic leadership and politics, is bound to fall behind countries that are empowering all of their citizens, female and male. So kind of suggesting get everyone on the team and you'll have better outcomes than those that don't. I'll just bring up this one as well. This was a a report done. While it's loading up, I'll go back to it. This is a report done looking at women's attitudes and men's attitudes in the fashion industry. And as you can see here, 100% of women surveyed see gender equality as an issue in fashion, while less than 50% of men do. So obviously, two very different perspectives on the same industry. And if you look at the words that came up more often for women, it was bias, unfair, boys club, although equal was in there as well. And for men, when they talked about words to describe their experience of working in the fashion industry, men would say it was fun, diverse, fair, and equal. And if you consider this, where are we? Okay, yes, okay, where is it? If you're interested in this topic, it's worth having a look at this report. Um, but this, I think this statistic was 14. Was it 14%? Where it was? Yeah. Only 14% of major brands have a woman in charge. Yet, now consider this: if 76%, no, 86%, sorry, if 86% of people in charge of the fashion industry are men, would women's fashion look different if women were in charge of the fashion industry? So once again, if you have gender equality, that then potentially translates into what fashion actually looks like. Is this could be a man's perspective of what women should be wearing, but may not necessarily be what women want to wear, or at least bring in women into the sort of mix and let them decide and have their inputs as to what the brand should look like. So it's a hot issue at the moment, gender equality, but just remember different genders will bring different perspectives to the aesthetics of fashion. And so the more perspectives you had, the better it is. If we look at this map here, this is a map that looks at gender inequality in social institutions. So red means there's a high level of inequality between the genders, and orange is relatively low level of inequality. And so we're talking about things like uh, family code. So it's like, who makes the decision within the family? Is it the mother and father together that they discuss the issue, or is it the father that sort of just makes the decisions and that's it, and the mother has to wear them? Property rights, often in many countries, it's the husband's name that's on the title to the house, not the woman's, the wife's. So that kind of thing, who owns properties, legal ownership of properties, physical integrity, how safe it is in those countries for women, and civil liberties or freedom of speech expression, etc. Now, we as a company, we look at this map and we can take two perspectives on it. We can say, I'm not going to source garments from any of the red countries because they practice gender inequality. We don't believe in gender inequality, therefore we'll stick to the orange countries. So that's one option. The other option is to do the reverse and say, no, we will definitely source from a a high discrimination society, but we're going to run our factory in a way in which it empowers women in that factory and sort of raises the issue of gender inequality. So again, it depends on where the brand sits and where it wants to go in terms of this issue, if it wants to take this issue on at all. As I say, it doesn't need to. All of these help move us out of the critical deprivation position in Kate Raworth's donut. Malala. Malala is a face, or one of the faces, of gender inequality in the world. You may know her or know of her story. Basically, she was a student in in Pakistan. I think she was 12 years old, 13 years old. She spoke up at school one day or somewhere publicly the need for children to be educated, um, and She spoke up one day about the need for girls to be educated in school. And anyway, one day on a bus, she was on the bus, school bus on the way home. The Taliban, because it was on the border of Afghanistan, the Taliban pulled up in the bus, asked for Malala. She says, "It's me." And the soldier told her she needs to go home because as a girl, she doesn't need to go to school. The Taliban's position at that stage was all women did not need an education because their role was to raise children and stay at home. Malala made the mistake of speaking up there, and the soldier shot her in the face. Now, fortunately, she survived and went on to build a reputation campaigning around equality for women and education for women in the world. Why I bring her up is once again having a global awareness of people such as these allows us to consider whether we want Malala to be part of our brand or we want to associate with her foundation. And again, we'll have a look at this in the tutorial. But again, keep an eye out on some of the figures in the world that may promote our brand. Remembering fashion nowadays, and it's not just fashion, but fashion nowadays is about the relationships you build in your supply chain. And it's not just about where you get the fabric from and who you get to make the garment. It's also some of these other organizations like Malala's Foundation is part of that. Okay, income and work. Income is important because gainful employment not only provides the obvious economic benefits, but it is integral to the self-esteem and personal development of individuals. Even though we might not like work some days, it's actually good for us. It helps us, makes us feel better about ourselves. Certainly, we're feeling it a little bit now with COVID-19, perhaps, and sort of the sense of isolation and the impact that isolation has on our mental health is real, and work is a counter to that. So, as a species, the human race thrives on hope and yearns for prosperity. Being a productive individual is part of what we are. So, when we run our business, our fashion business, we're not only providing a product and service to the end customer, but we're actually employing a lot of people and giving them jobs and potential prosperity in their lives. So, that's one of the great positives of business, that it does that. However, we need to be aware of some of the problems of not having a job. And if you look at the map on the left, sorry, the chart on the left, this is 5 years old. It hasn't changed much now, although it's probably worse actually. This is youth unemployment up to 25. So people under 25, more or less your age, and in Spain, it's sitting at 50%. So Spain and Greece, more than half of young people have no job. And then it scales down. Right at the other end, you've got the very efficient and productive economy of Germany, which does find jobs, or there are jobs available for young people in Germany. But what does it mean for Spanish youth and Greek youth is they'll start to move to some of these other countries to get jobs. And so obviously those dots that we saw before um, symbolised some of these people going to countries like Germany to get jobs. Certainly Greece has had an incredible drain of um, the workforce because the prospects of a decent living in Greece is very, very slim now. So people are just leaving their countries and going elsewhere. Same if we look at it from a global perspective, then youth unemployment highest in the Arab states, followed by North, South, and Western Europe. So we look at these charts and say, well, uh, is there scope for us to set up a factory or some part of our supply chain in Greece and provide work? I mean, one, because we'll get um, potential workers relatively easily because of the high unemployment rate, but also because, you know, if we had to make a choice between Greece and say, I don't know, Poland, then perhaps we might pick Greece because we want to be an employer of people. Again, it's just part of this social foundation of deciding where we can have the most impact in there. Um, I've put this picture up of the war because a war-torn city, again, because there's a significant amount of evidence to suggest that where you have high youth unemployment, particularly amongst young men, you also have the ingredients for disastrous situations, you know. Um, so war, or at least destabilisation, and high rates of unemployment. Um, there's a correlation between the two that needs to be looked at. Closer to home in Australia, then, if we look at this top map of Australia, just to give you an idea, the hotspots for youth unemployment, again, a couple of years old: Tasmania, 21%, western suburbs of Melbourne, 18%, outback Queensland, 67%. So basically, there's not much to do there for young people. And what you do is you see them heading towards the coast, towards Brisbane, Sydney, and Melbourne to look for work. The other charts show you pretty much the same thing. The only one I want to sort of focus on is this red one, the participation rate for youth, 15 to 24-year-olds. And, between, you see this after, in about 2008, you saw this dramatic decline in participation rate. This is probably more problematic than the actual unemployment rate. This is young people actively looking for work. And when it goes down like that, that's saying that's young people giving up trying to even find a job. And, unemployment's one thing, but people losing hope of ever getting a job is a greater problem. And once again, we're back to the center of the donut and the potential for people to be in this critical state of poverty and just can't find a way out of it. Equally on the right, I should mention this one as well. The red represents full-time work, the blue part-time work or casual work, and the trend in Australia, and indeed in many countries in the world, is the casualisation of the workforce. So it's harder to get full-time work and the stability that goes with having a regular income. And that's a problem. So most companies have jumped at the opportunity to casualise their workforce because, it means a savings. But again, I question that. I think it's a false economy. You casualise the workforce and you're telling the workers that you don't care about them. They're just there to work for you, and you'll find that the workers will reciprocate. They'll give you the same amount back. If you give them a full-time job and give them a sense of security, you might find you get more out of those people. But obviously, you've got to balance that against the costs. So, greater opportunities tend to exist in urban areas, leading to urbanisation. So we talked about that when we talked about the mega cities. Basically, you go to the big cities because there's better chance of getting jobs, and that's a global phenomenon. And participation rate reflects the individual's expectations. So I'm going to spend a few minutes on income. Um, it's not enough just to have a job and just to have an income. The income has to be sufficient amount to enable an individual to live with dignity and health for the entirety of their life, which brings up this issue of a minimum wage or a fair wage. And we're going to spend a whole lecture on this later on, so I'm not going to go into much detail on this at this stage, but it's what I'll sort of plant the seed of is it may not be enough to just pay whatever the government says you must pay a worker. Maybe we should pay them a little bit more. This is best represented in Australia by the Sunshine Harvester case. This is a famous court case in Australian history where, I don't know if you're familiar with Sunshine, it's a suburb in the western suburbs of Melbourne. And back then, in that where their clock tower is now, it's a shopping centre now, but it used to be a factory that made these harvesters. These are harvesters that collected grain, wheat grain. Anyway, the workers went on strike because they felt they weren't being paid enough. The company said, we're not going to pay you anymore because we're going to go broke. They went to court, and at court, Justice Higgins made a ruling that had landmark implications for Australia. Basically, have a look at this. Basically, he said the judgment ruled that an employer was obliged to pay his employees a wage that guaranteed them a standard of living which was reasonable for a human being in a civilized community to live in frugal comfort, so basic comfort, estimated by current standards. And this last point is very, very important, regardless of the employer's capacity to pay. So Justice Higgins in that court case made it very clear to say if you run a business and you can't afford to pay your employers, or you're not competitive because you have to pay your employers that wage, then Justice Higgins said you should go out of business. Now the counter argument you always hear in these situations is companies say, well, if you can just cut your wages a bit, we can still stay in business. And the problem with that, taking that approach, is then they start doing it every year. Can you cut your wages a bit more and a bit more so we stay competitive? Uh, in 1907, by Justice Higgins uh, coming down with this ruling, he made it quite clear to all businesses and business people, don't go into business unless you have a model which can sustain the wages that give people a decent standard of living. So it's part of the reason why Australia has always had relatively high wages, or not always, but certainly in the latter half of the 20th century, it's done so. So let's look at income from three different perspectives, because when we say income, it starts getting a bit complex about, how much should I pay my workers? And bear with me as I go through these three. It gets a little bit sort of convoluted, perhaps. Okay, GDP, you may have heard of this if you did economics at year 12 or something, or back in secondary school. GDP measures all financial transactions within a country over a given time period. It's a very linear way of measuring wealth of a country. And then what the World Bank goes and does and says you either belong to the high income, middle, or low income countries. Now, what that means, what that looks like is this. If we measure GDP by country, the United States of America comes out as number one in the world, with 24% of all of the wealth in the world being generated by one country. Remember, they only represent 5% of the world's population, but 24% of its wealth. China is catching up very quickly with 15%. And then, as you can see, Japan, Germany, United Kingdom, much, much smaller economies compared to the two giants of the US and China. So that's one measure of how you measure the wealth or the income of a people. But that's $20 trillion, by the way. Yeah, 20 trillion, 20 billion. Sorry, excuse me, 20 billion. No, $20 trillion, um, by the way. Now, that doesn't mean much, but if we divide that 20 trillion by the population of the United States, we find they go from number one to number eight in the world, to 62,000 per person, for every man, woman, and child in the United States is their income. So why I'm showing you this is to say the problem with this linear approach is it doesn't kind of give us the real truth about how rich or poor a country is, because in this chart on the left it says the US is number one. On this one it says it's number eight, and it says every man, woman, and child earns $62,000 a year. We know that that's not true. Some earn millions, some earn very little in the United States. So it's a very simplistic way of measuring things. If we look at who's at Bangladesh down the bottom, just to give you a perspective, what you find, I was just looking for Australia. Australia is number 10 at 56,000. A Bangladeshi worker earns, if you like, 1,698 US dollars per year. So you can employ a Bangladeshi for just on 1,700 US dollars. That's why companies like Target, Kmart go to Bangladesh to get their clothes made. It's just for that one simple reason. So we've got this measure, relatively simple. If we look at it on a map, the wealthiest countries are in the green. So once again, North America, Western Europe, Australia, Japan, New Zealand, and then down through the oranges to the reds being the least amount. Same spread, developed world, developing world. The second one is a little bit more interesting. Remember, this is in the context of how much we have to pay someone. Purchasing power parity, or PPP, compares how much money is required to purchase the same product in different countries. So if I pose this question to you, is an income of $2 per hour a decent wage? Now, if you're sitting in Australia, you'd say no way, but that's not quite the right answer. The answer is it depends on what that $2 buys. Depends on the power of that, the purchasing power of that $2. And one of the best ways or famous ways in which that's measured, where is it? The Economist magazine came up with what they call the Big Mac Index because they had basically a global standardized commodity, a Big Mac, and they measured how much, in this case, how many hours you have to work to buy a Big Mac. And again, this is a bit old, but it's a good graphic, and I couldn't find a more recent one for this one. But let's go down to Sydney. So according to this, in Sydney, you would have to work 20 minutes in an average job to be able to afford a Big Mac. But in Jakarta, in 2009, you would have to work just over 2 hours, a bit over 2 hours, to buy that same Big Mac. Now, some people might say that's a good thing because you shouldn't eat junk food. So it's a great disincentive to it. However, what it suggests is the purchasing power of someone who working in Sydney compared to someone working in Jakarta is significantly different when it comes to buying a Big Mac. If we were to employ someone in Jakarta, do we want to give them enough money so that they can buy a Big Mac after working 20 minutes or 30 minutes? That's the question that we have to start considering when we talk about paying a fair wage. And these are difficult questions because they're subjective. It's up to your own morality to decide whether that's fair or not. Okay, the last one then we're going to look at when we measure income is the HDI, or the Human Development Index. Relatively new measure, but this time it measures three things. It measures how long you're going to live for, how much education you have, and if you like, the income or the standard of living that you have. And if we look at this measure, we don't see on the right, we don't see the United States number one. Indeed, we don't see the United States in the top 10 countries in the world when it comes to the HDI. We see Norway up the top, Switzerland, Ireland. Australia's number 6. 3 years ago, we were number 1. I think it was 3 years ago, 4 years ago. We've dropped since then, or other countries have improved. But look what it gives us a percentage score. So 100 is perfect, or 1, I should say, is perfect. Life expectancy for an Australian, if you're born today in Australia, you'll live till you're 83 on average. It is expected that an Australian will do 22 years of schooling. Look at that compared to Hong Kong, Germany, Ireland, a lot more. Good and bad. That either means because there's no jobs, so you're going to have to stay at school longer, or it means we're the smartest people in the world. I'll leave that up to you to decide which of those two is the more accurate. And then your gross national income, or your GDP, if you like, the one. So, the question is, should we be using this index to start to get a better idea of the standard of living in those countries and how much we need to pay, rather than the simplistic gross domestic product? And then I'll just put in the lowest at the other end of the spectrum so we understand where we're at 37%. Life expectancy in Nigeria is 62 years of age, 52 in Central African republics. That's the average age, so significantly lower than Australia. 6.5 years of schooling. Now, if most people in that country only have 6.5 years of schooling, how can they generate doctors, surgeons, lecturers, everything, and then progress their country? It's very, very hard to do it when you're at that place. So this is a country with critical human deprivation. Should we be considering investing there or sourcing in that country to give them the opportunity to improve their way? And then gross national income is just under $1,000 a year is the average income in that country. So all told, if we look at these measurements, we see a progression. And this is this transition from the linear world, as I said, the GDP still used by politicians, still used by economists. However, as the world gets more complex, we're starting to say things aren't simple. You can't categorize people as easily as you could before, and we're moving to a more holistic way of measuring income and wealth in a country. And indeed, another one is uh, GNH, gross national happiness. It's another measure which measures the happiest countries in the world. And on that one, the country of Bhutan is the happiest, whereas on GDP rankings, it would be quite low. They're happy people, and a country like Australia's the other way, relatively low in terms of happiness. Another thing that does make us unhappy is the distribution of wealth. Who has the money in the world? And this image here is a little bit convoluted, but basically try to read it as the picture of the blue man represents population. So here it's 71 on the left-hand side. Sorry, I'll use my mouse. I'm pointing. 71% of the world's population owns 3% of the world's wealth. And at the other side, end of the spectrum, 0.7% of the world's population owns almost half of the world's wealth, is one figure. So depending how they measure it, you're going to get variations. But what's consistent is we're at a point in human history where the concentration of wealth in a few people is incredibly high. Indeed, as it says here, or it suggests here, that the richest 8 people on Earth own the same wealth as the poorest 50%. That's 3.5 billion people on Earth own the same wealth as 8 human beings on Earth. And if you want to know who they are, let's have a look at them. I'm sure you'll guess some of them. Let's see.
The 8 richest people in the world own the same wealth as 3.6 billion people, the poorest half of the world. Bill Gates, founder of Microsoft. Amancio Ortega, founder of Inditex.
Owns Zara.
Warren Buffett, largest shareholder in Berkshire Hathaway. Carlos Slim Helú, owner of Grupo Carso. Jeff Bezos, founder and CEO of Amazon. Mark Zuckerberg, co-founder and CEO of Facebook. Larry Ellison, co-founder and CEO of Oracle. Michael Bloomberg, founder and CEO of Bloomberg LP.
So again, just a little sort of diversion there to show you, as I said, thinking back to that those first images of people trying to get on trucks to get to the United Kingdom, just to hopefully have a chance at a better life. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you've got these people who have accumulated an enormous amount of wealth. Is that sustainable? I don't think so. Something has to change in that mix. Okay, we'll keep going through them. Health. Now, this is the health of the individual, central to sustainable development, because good health allows a child to survive disease and develop both physically and mentally. A child that is in ill health may have those or bear those problems all the way through their lives. So it's critical in early development of a child that they get access to good health. What has that got to do with us? Well, in our industry, we employ many young mothers in developing countries to make our clothes. Is there an opportunity for us to either provide a stipend to those young mothers, or to organise doctors to come into the factory for health checks for the children? I mean, these are all things that we can consider. Allow students to excel at school, and then therefore progress and educate themselves, as I was saying before. Allows people people to be productive members of the workforce, adds to the human capital of society, thus attracting investment, thus increasing economic development. So education is pivotal for a nation to move up this economic development model pathway. Absolute key. Without it, they kind of are stuck in one spot. So what is our obligation to health and education in that? These ones I'll go through fairly quickly. Food, um, obviously a good diet is a basis for living disease and for healthy living. Should we as a company provide food for our staff? And if we're not going to do that, are we going to provide them with a lunch break? What's happening, not just in developing countries, but definitely here in Australia, is it's harder and harder to have a decent time off for lunch, because either you have meetings or you have other issues in there, and that impinges on the worker's quality of life. So food and time to eat food is part of the mix and what we need to consider in our business. I just thought I'd throw up these two charts. This one, the next one I'm going to show you in terms of individual nutrition and percentage of the population that's undernourished. So red is bad again, 35% undernourished. They don't get the bare minimum that they need in terms of nutrients. And again, parts of Africa are in the red, South America, and the green ones, which high level, high nutrition, nutritious diet, North America, Australia, Western Europe are the ones. Same pattern once again that we see over and over. Perversely, we have obesity is a form of malnutrition because often people aren't eating the right foods, eating foods with a lot of sugar, particularly in the Western diet, and that leads to obesity, and that's a kind of form of poverty as well. And once again, here it's flipped. And as you can see by the red and orange, you're finding North America, Western Europe, and Australia in the yellow zones have higher levels of obesity. So again, the people sitting up in the tree living really well, so well that they're just eating poorly. Okay, this is the one that's more of relevance to us at the moment. It's a term that you may have heard of, may not have heard of, but you will hear of more and more. The idea of food security. As we said before, the planet's population is growing. The planet is not growing. Therefore, each country is now having to think about how they're going to secure food for their populations. Something which wasn't as important last century, but it certainly is now. And we've got the dark green as the best performance in terms of food securities. Australia, Western Europe, North America are the ones that have an abundance of food. And then green to the yellows, which needs improvement in there. Indeed, we've got countries like both China and Saudi Arabia have got food security programs in place, and they're buying farms all over the planet to secure food for their people. So to ensure they're selling food they're producing food on these farms and selling it on the global markets, but by controlling the farms, they can control where the food goes and what rate and what price it goes there at. So they're thinking ahead to try to ensure that their people get enough to eat. Why it's particularly important to the fashion industry is because we need the same land to grow cotton that other countries may want to grow food. And so potentially in the future, the fashion industry will be in competition with the food industry for land usage. And that can be quite sensitive. Do we want our brand to be labelled as sort of starving a people or forcing up the price of food because all of the land was used to grow cotton? Something to consider. Certainly starting to happen in northern Queensland where they grow cotton, use an enormous amount of water, and they're denying water to dairy farmers who are now basically leaving the land in New South Wales and Victoria because they just can't afford the water because it's being purchased by cotton farmers. So that's where we're starting to see these tensions begin to arise between the two. This is a correlation between food prices and political unrest. These lines represent food prices. When we had these two spikes in 2008 and then 11, we had civil unrest in 30 countries with a spike in food prices, and then the Arab uprising also coincided with the food prices. What you have to remember that if the price of a loaf of bread goes up by 20 cents in Australia, you probably won't even notice it. But if the price of bread goes up by 20% in a developing country, that is significant for that family. That means that family doesn't eat that night or eats less. So it's very sensitive, food prices. That's why if you're growing cotton on land that can grow wheat or rice, be aware of the sensitivities of this issue. Okay, we're getting there. Voice. Kate Raworth says people have to have a voice. So the empowerment of individuals by having the ability to express a political opinion without fear. Why? Because in 1900, women were paid half the wage that a man was paid, because in 1900, the perception was, the social norm was that women were only worth half a man, therefore they should be paid half a man. And equally, a child should be paid half the wage of a woman. Remember, in 1900, children could work in Australia in factories and stuff. There was no law against children working here. And it was only through a political voice, through protests, through campaigns, people speaking up, that you start to, one, get a law that stops children working, making it illegal to work, and secondly, starting to equalise the pay between men and women in this country. It's not quite equal, but it's certainly a lot better than it was in the past, all through voice. So allowing people to express their views and opinions makes for a better country, but also for a better company. If everyone in your company is free and feels comfortable to speak, then chances are you're going to get better outcomes. You'll have a more productive workforce, rather than just telling them, if you don't work, I'm going to sack you or intimidate them, whatever. An extension of that is social equity, implies fair access to livelihood, education, resources, full participation in the political and cultural life of the community, self-determination in meeting fundamental needs. So you're probably familiar with some of these figures. Nelson Mandela campaigned to end apartheid in South Africa, where blacks and white-coloured people were treated separately, had to go to separate toilets and everything else. Mahatma Gandhi in India campaigned for the British colonisers to go back to their own country and allow India to govern themselves. Martin Luther King in the United States also campaigned for black rights there. And in Australia, there was a campaign for Aborigines to, excuse me, for Aborigines to be counted as people, because believe it or not, until 1967, when the government did a census count to see how many people there were in the country, Aborigines were put in the category of flora and fauna, so basically in the category of animals, and non-Aboriginals were counted as people. And so there was a campaign to change that. Once again, it's the same thing as gender inequality. If you deny certain people in your society or in your factory or in your business or in your office a right to speak and a right to equal access to everything, then you're denying yourself an opportunity to be enriched by the ideas that might come out of those people. So social equity is important. As Martin Luther King says, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Okay, energy. The only thing I'll say about this, don't assume that everyone in the world has access to electricity. And indeed, if you look here at the red circles, that's the number of millions of people who don't have any electricity. They go to bed when the sun goes down and they wake up when the sun goes up. No TV, no lights, no computer. It's significant. It's also a problem for many factories in India, because in India, the electricity supply in certain parts of India is not consistent, and that has an impact on their ability to run a business, you know, throughout the day. Okay, water, again, we discussed it last time, so I won't spend much time on it. We discussed it, sorry, under the planetary boundaries, but obviously you've got to give access to water to human beings. Peace and justice. How are we going? We're almost there. Peace and justice encourages a civil society where differences are settled through reasoning. So you've got to have, within a society or a workplace, a way in which you can resolve disputes openly and fairly, and in a way in which both parties, the one that loses, if you like, and the one that wins, both eventually can see that at least they were both heard in that process. To give you an example of that, in Australia in 2018, they introduced the Modern Slavery Act, and they followed the United Kingdom's introduction of this act in, I think it was 2015 by memory. Basically, any company in Australia with revenues over $100 million has to produce a report every year detailing what they did to ensure that there was no slaves used in their supply chains wherever they were throughout the world. Um, you might be thinking slavery in the 21st century. Well, slavery is on the rise. They say it's something like 40 million people are in slavery at the moment. Might not be slavery as you might think in chains and locked up, but slavery takes the form of um, someone might organise, excuse me, for migrants to come to this country, and then their passport is taken away from them, and they might be forced into prostitution or some other activity, and basically they're too scared to speak up for fear of being sent home or fear of being arrested and imprisoned. So slavery and the way in which you imprison people is a little bit more subtle than using chains, but just as consequential. So something to be aware of. So this is a step in the right direction. It certainly puts companies on notice that they need to be aware of who's making the garments, in the case of the fashion industry, where it's made. It's still a little bit soft when it comes to punishment. There is no punishment. In the United Kingdom, there's um, uh, criminal punishment if CEOs are caught using slaves. In Australia, there's nothing like that, but it's the beginning of an awareness that you have to know what's happening within your supply chains. Housing as well. Kate Raworth suggests that housing is important for workers, or for people in general, sorry, for who are under critical human deprivation. At its essence is symbolic of belonging. Homelessness is often a symptom and cause of poverty and social exclusion, and can lead to other human rights violations arising from persons' vulnerability and lack of personal security. Nothing nicer than being able to go home at the end of the day or at night, and that's your haven. So some people who don't have that obviously don't have that security. An interesting footnote to this is Reiter. Reiter, I don't know if you're familiar with Reiter. It's a Swiss-based company that makes some of the spinning and weaving machines for the industry, and has been doing it for well over 100 years. And when they built one of their factories between 52 and 54, they also built homes for their workers. And it's very Swiss, of course, but they didn't see a distinction. They didn't see at that stage, and this is the early or the mid part of the Industrial Revolution. They said, not only will we employ you, but we'll give you a house to live in as well. It's something that sort of sounds quite foreign in Australia now. You wouldn't think a company is going to provide you with a house, but the question is, well, why not? Happens in some of the garment industries in China. The companies will provide housing or accommodation for the workers, particularly given a lot of the workers come from small villages and they're coming to the big cities. They've got nowhere to live, so the companies, as a way of luring staff in, will offer them accommodation. Parts of India as well, they do the same thing. They're trying to do the same thing. So providing housing may not necessarily be a bad thing. And in a country like Australia where rents are going up and the cost of accommodation's going up, it indeed could be an incentive to provide some form of accommodation. And I've just thrown up these two charts. If you look at house prices in Sydney and Melbourne, you'll see that they've been steadily tracking up at a pretty consistent rate. And remember, if the cost of housing and rental goes up, that means demands for higher wages in those cities are going to go up because people need more money to pay their bills. So does that mean we should set up our office in Brisbane, where accommodation is cheaper, or in Adelaide, or indeed better still, even in Perth? Is that the way to go? And in that way, we haven't got that pressure to have to pay even more money. Um, and the other indicator, again, it's about thinking holistically. Household debt. Australia has one of the highest household debts in the world at the moment, 180% of their income. And again, what that translates into is Australians needing higher salaries to maintain that debt. So when we think about investing in a country, we might look at figures like this to see, well, what's the trend with wages? Which way are they going to go? And certainly in a country like Australia, um, they need possibly to go up. Okay, coming to the end now. Kate Raworth says, and I also concur, that this is one of the most important ones, networks. In order to get people out of critical human deprivation, they've got to have access to networks or access to other people. By having access to other people, you get to hear what's going on, you get to hear whether new jobs are coming up, and you're in the know, if you like, you're in the loop. The more networks you're connected to, the greater potential for opportunities to arise from it. And the network I want to introduce you to in terms of fashion and sustainability is the penultimate conference, which is the Copenhagen Fashion Conference, held every year in Denmark. It's evolved over the last few years to be the place to be. So that's why I just want to make you aware of it. They've changed the date of it because of COVID-19, but it's definitely one that is attended by all the global players, Nike, H&M, Zara. They're all there. They're all talking about sustainability in fashion. So it's a conference worth checking out. I don't know if they're going to. My criticism of it has always been that you couldn't get access to it unless you paid a fortune, and they weren't broadcasting it online. So I'm not sure this year whether they're going to make it available online or not. Yeah, not quite sure. 10 years to bend the curve of climate crisis. Okay, no worries. But definitely check that out if you've got an interest in sustainability in fashion. Watch out to see what they do at Copenhagen. As I said, it's a meeting where they'll get together. They may come up with sort of ideas, or at least they'll express what different companies are doing, and that tends to set the direction for the next 12 months of the fashion industry. So it's one of the key events to be networked into. Okay, how are we going? Still awake? So that's more or less all of them. It just gives you a bit of indication. We as a company employ people, and we can engage any one of these tools, if you like, to allow people, our workforce, to move out of critical human deprivation and have a life which is, as I said, fulfilling and prosperous as well. And the challenge, of course, is not to overshoot and burn up the Earth's resources to live a life that's very comfortable. Okay, they're the two possible frameworks. As I said, I'll just briefly talk about this, and it'll be 3-4 minutes at the most, the Sustainable Development Goals, only because you'll see these more and more floating around there, floating around in reports and in documentation. So I just wanted to make you aware of it. So developmental goals came out of the United Nations. In 2000, they set what they call the MDGs, or Millennial Development Goals, and they set themselves a 5-year objective to improve the lives of the poorest people on earth. And they had 8 simple objectives. eradicate extreme hunger, achieve universal primary education, etc. And by and large, they succeeded. There was an incredible, in those years, there was an incredible amount of development and improvement in the lives of some of the poorest people on Earth, partly because the global economy was growing really strong and there was a lot of money floating around, particularly in the Western world. So it was easy to get money to fund a myriad of uh, projects which achieved these goals. And partly because the world was globalizing, so there was an awareness too that poverty wasn't out of sight, out of mind. We kind of knew it was there. So, on the back of the MDGs being largely successful, the United Nations became a little bit more ambitious and came up with the STGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And so they drew more pretty squares. In fact, they drew 17 squares and sort of said, these are the 17 objectives that we want to achieve. No poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, etc., all the way, and life below water. So they're similar to, or there's an overlap between the Johan Rockström's planetary boundaries, which like climate action number 13, and Kate Raworth's social economy as well. So it's just another model that sets objectives about improving them. Fair bit of criticism around these because some environmentalists see them as a bit cynical because they don't have really clear sort of objectives. They just say life below water should be improved. Well, what does that mean? How do you improve it? Hey, there's 2 zero hungers. Look at that. I never noticed that before. Interesting. Right. But um, brands, as we'll see when we look at Hugo Boss in a few weeks' time, Hugo Boss in their annual report have use these objectives in their report to say, well, this is what we did when it came to responsible consumption and production. So you're starting to see companies sort of dovetail their reports into the SDGs. Whether it continues or not, I don't know. We'll see. So, in summary, we have 3 frameworks we looked at. The planetary boundaries was the last 2 weeks, which helps explain nature and how we impact on nature. Doughnut economics helps explain how we can improve the lives of the least fortunate people on Earth to get them into a decent standard of living. And the SDGs, as I just explained, just there. So the objective of a business is to successfully merchandise garments. Okay, that's the first thing. That's the linear part. To be a successful business, you've got to sell garments. Whilst, and this is the holistic part, whilst enhancing people's lives, whether it's customers, people in our supply chain, and the health of the planet. So 3 objectives in there. And what we're starting to see is more and more businesses operate under this model of trying to achieve these objectives. You may have heard of the term CSR, or corporate social responsibility. That's a bit of an old term now, but it's kind of what this represents as well. Okay, I think we've pretty much I've explained that. So planetary boundaries, ecological systems, social systems explained or quantified by Kate Raworth's social economy. And then, the kind of SDGs sort of overlap a bit of both and sit in there. But we're going to primarily focus on planetary boundaries and the social economy. Thank you for that. Well done for hanging in there. I know it was a lot of information. But as of next week, we start the process of developing a range of clothes. So we start applying some of these theories, and hopefully by applying it, it reinforces your knowledge and understanding of it. Okay, see you in the tutorials. Thank you.